Sometimes the cruelest choice isn't between right and wrong. It's between two things you love more than life itself. Ruth never imagined that after surviving 47 years in the harsh mountains, her greatest test wouldn't come from nature, but from the heartless men now standing over her. In the dusty town square, she kneels in chains between thunder and shadow, the two dogs who saved her life countless times. For years, they were her only family in the wilderness. They shared her food when there wasn't enough. They kept her warm through brutal winters. They protected her from dangers she never saw coming. The outlaws want to break her spirit before they break her body. They point their guns at each dog and demand she choose which one dies. The whole town watches, waiting to see what she'll do. But Ruth has a plan that none of them expect. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. 6 months earlier, the first light of dawn crept over the Rocky Mountain peaks, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose. Ruth Caldwell stood on the wooden porch of her cabin, a steaming cup of coffee warming her weathered hands. At 47, she carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who had learned to depend on no one but herself and the two faithful companions sleeping at her feet. Thunder, a massive German shepherd mix with intelligent amber eyes, lifted his grizzled head at the sound of her stirring. His coat, once pure black, now showed silver threads around his muzzle, a testament to the 7 years they'd shared in these mountains. Beside him, Shadow stretched her lean frame, the border collie's black and white fur catching the morning light. She was younger, perhaps 5 years old, but possessed an almost supernatural awareness of Ruth's moods and needs. The cabin itself told the story of a woman who had chosen solitude over society. Built from lodgepole pine and chinked with mountain clay, it sat nestled in a natural clearing surrounded by towering evergreens. Ruth's late husband, Samuel, had chosen this spot carefully, close enough to a freshwater stream for practical needs, elevated enough to spot approaching visitors or dangers, and remote enough that the nearest neighbor was a 2-hour ride through treacherous mountain trails. Inside the one-room cabin, every item served a purpose. A pot-bellied stove dominated one corner, its iron surface worn smooth from years of use. Ruth's bed occupied another corner, covered with quilts she'd sewn herself during the long winter months. A sturdy wooden table, scarred from years of preparing meals and cleaning game, stood beneath the single window that faced east toward the rising sun. On the mantelpiece above the fireplace sat Samuel's most precious possession, a simple wooden cross he had carved during their first winter together. His hands, already weakened by the consumption that would eventually claim him, had worked the pine with infinite patience, creating something beautiful from the raw materials the mountain provided. Ruth touched it every morning, a ritual that connected her to the man who had loved her enough to bring her to this place of peace. The brass compass that had belonged to Samuel's father rested beside the cross, its needle still pointing true north despite its age. 3 generations of Caldwell men had carried it through various adventures and hardships, and now it served as Ruth's guide when she ventured beyond familiar territory. Samuel had pressed it into her hands during his final days, making her promise to always find her way home. Ruth's daily routine had evolved over the 3 years since Samuel's death. She rose before dawn, tended to the animals, 2 goats, a handful of chickens, and her beloved dogs, then spent the morning hours checking her trap lines and small garden. The afternoon brought maintenance tasks, repairing fences, chopping wood, mending clothes, or preserving food for the harsh winters that could isolate her for months at a time. Thunder had originally belonged to a family in the valley below, but when the mountain wolves had grown bold one terrible winter, the dog had been injured defending their livestock. Ruth had nursed him back to health, and when spring came, Thunder simply refused to leave her side. The family, recognizing the bond that had formed, had quietly relinquished any claim to him. Shadow's arrival had been more dramatic. Ruth had found her as a pup, nearly frozen and abandoned beside a stream swollen with spring snowmelt. Someone had clearly tried to drown the litter, but Shadow had somehow survived. Ruth had spent weeks nursing the tiny creature back to health, feeding her with a cloth soaked in goat's milk, and keeping her warm against her own body during the cold mountain nights. Both dogs had proven themselves invaluable companions. Thunder's size and intimidating presence deterred most predators, while his keen intelligence made him an excellent guardian. Shadow's herding instincts helped manage the goats, and her incredible sense of smell often alerted Ruth to approaching weather changes or unwelcome visitors. Long before human senses could detect them, the dogs had also provided something Ruth hadn't expected: emotional healing. After Samuel's death, the silence of the mountains had threatened to swallow her whole. The sound of Thunder's deep bark echoing across the valley, or Shadow's gentle whining when she sensed Ruth's sadness, had pulled her back from the edge of despair more times than she cared to count. Ruth's isolation wasn't complete. Once a month, she made the treacherous journey down to Miller's Creek, a small settlement that served as a trading post for the scattered families and hermits who called these mountains home. She would trade preserved meat, hand-knitted items, and the occasional bag of herbs for supplies she couldn't produce herself: coffee, sugar, ammunition, and news from the outside world. The proprietor, an elderly man named Henrik, who had lost his own wife to a fever years earlier, always treated Ruth with gentle respect. He never pressed her for conversation, but his kind eyes and patient manner made her feel less alone in the world. Sometimes, if she was lucky, there would be a letter waiting for her, correspondence from her sister back east, who still held hope that Ruth might someday return to civilization. But Ruth had no intention of leaving these mountains. Here, surrounded by the raw beauty of creation and the companionship of creatures who asked nothing more than food, shelter, and affection, she had found a peace that the outside world could never provide. The memory of Samuel was strongest here, in the cabin they had built together. Along the trails they had walked side by side. Beneath the stars they had watched from their porch on warm summer evenings. The changing seasons marked the passage of time in ways that no calendar could capture. Spring brought the return of wildflowers and the sound of running water as snow melted from the high peaks. Summer offered long days of warmth and the opportunity to stockpile resources for the harder months ahead. Autumn painted the aspen groves in brilliant gold and reminded Ruth to complete her preparations for winter's arrival. Winter itself was both the most challenging and most beautiful time of year. Snowdrifts could pile 20 feet high, sealing the cabin off from the outside world for months at a time. But there was something profoundly peaceful about those quiet months, when the only sounds were the crackling of the fire, the whisper of wind through the pines, and the gentle breathing of her sleeping dogs. During those long winter evenings, Ruth would work on her handicrafts, knitting sweaters and socks, sewing quilts, or carving small items from scraps of wood. The dogs would sprawl before the fire, their fur radiating warmth, while Ruth let her mind wander back to happier times. She would remember Samuel's laugh, the way his eyes crinkled when he smiled, the gentle strength of his hands as he taught her to shoot, to hunt, to survive in this unforgiving landscape. It was Samuel who had first suggested they retreat to the mountains. He had seen too much violence during his years as a territorial lawman, had witnessed too many good people destroyed by the greed and cruelty that seemed to flourish in the growing towns and cities. Here, he had promised her they could build something clean and honest, a life based on simple virtues like hard work, kindness to animals, and respect for the natural world. Ruth had embraced that vision completely. She had learned to read the weather patterns, to identify edible plants, to track animals through snow and mud. Samuel had taught her to handle firearms with respect and precision, skills that had already saved her life more than once when bears or mountain lions had threatened her small homestead. As the morning sun climbed higher, painting the cabin walls with golden light, Ruth felt the familiar contentment that came with another day of simple survival. Thunder stretched and padded over to lean against her legs, his massive head resting on her thigh. Shadow followed, settling at Ruth's feet with a gentle sigh. This was her world, small perhaps, but complete. She had everything she needed: shelter, food, companionship, and the profound satisfaction that came from living according to her own values rather than society's expectations. The nearest neighbors were the Hendricks family, a young couple with 3 small children who had claimed a valley about 6 miles southeast. Ruth occasionally encountered them during her trips to Miller's Creek, and they always exchanged polite greetings, but she was careful not to become too involved in their lives. Ruth had learned that attachment brought pain, and she had endured enough pain for one lifetime. Better to maintain friendly distance, to help when asked, but not to invest too deeply in relationships that might be severed by death, disease, or the simple restlessness that drove so many people to abandon their claims and seek their fortunes elsewhere. But the dogs were different. They had chosen her as surely as she had chosen them, and their loyalty was absolute. They asked nothing more than food, shelter, and affection, gifts Ruth was more than happy to provide. In return, they offered protection, companionship, and a kind of unconditional love that reminded her daily of the good that still existed in the world. As she prepared to begin another day of mountain living, Ruth had no way of knowing that dark clouds were gathering beyond the horizon, that the peace she had built so carefully was about to be shattered by forces she couldn't control or predict. For now, there was only the morning sun, the sound of thunder's contented breathing, and the simple pleasure of being alive in one of the most beautiful places on earth. The acrid smell of smoke reached Ruth's nostrils before she crested the ridge overlooking the Hendricks homestead. Thunder's hackles rose as he caught the scent, and Shadow pressed close to Ruth's leg, whimpering softly. What they found in the valley below made Ruth's stomach clench with dread. The Hendricks cabin was nothing more than a blackened skeleton against the morning sky. Wisps of smoke still curled from the charred remains, indicating the fire had been recent, perhaps only hours old. Ruth dismounted from her horse and approached the devastation on foot, her rifle ready, the dogs flanking her with alert tension. The scene told a story of violence and deliberate destruction. This hadn't been an accidental fire caused by an overturned lantern or sparks from the chimney. The barn had been burned separately, the chicken coop destroyed, and the family's meager possessions scattered and trampled in the dirt. Most chilling of all, there were no bodies, no sign of what had happened to John and Mary Hendricks and their 3 young children. Thunder growled low in his throat as he investigated a patch of disturbed earth near what had been the cabin's front door. Ruth knelt beside him and found boot prints, too many boot prints for a family of 5. At least 6 men had been here, possibly more. The tracks were fresh, the edges still sharp in the morning dew. Near the well, Ruth discovered something that made her blood run cold. A torn piece of paper, partially burned but still legible, bore the crude image of a skull and crossbones. Below it, in rough lettering, were the words, "Copper Creek Gang, Death to Settlers." Ruth had heard whispers of this group during her last visit to Miller's Creek. They were said to be deserters from various armies, criminals fleeing justice, and other dangerous men who had banded together under the leadership of someone called Jackson Briggs. Shadow began barking frantically, drawing Ruth's attention to something glinting in the ashes near the cabin's rear wall. Wrapped in Ruth's handkerchief, she carefully extracted a small silver locket, the kind a mother might wear with pictures of her children inside. Mary Hendricks had worn one just like it during their last encounter at the trading post. The implications hit Ruth like a physical blow. The Hendricks family was either dead or had been taken prisoner. Either way, their fate was sealed by the same brutal men who had reduced their home to ash and cinders. But worse than the immediate tragedy was the realization that she was now completely alone in this vast wilderness. The Hendricks homestead had been her closest neighbor, the only other human presence for miles in any direction. Ruth mounted her horse and began the grim ride back to her own cabin, her mind racing with terrible possibilities. If the gang was systematically targeting isolated homesteads, her own refuge was no longer safe. The peace she had built so carefully over 3 years was crumbling. and she faced choices that would have seemed impossible just hours earlier. Thunder and Shadow seemed to sense her distress, staying closer than usual as they made their way through the familiar forest trails. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves, now carried the potential for danger. Ruth found herself constantly checking over her shoulder, her hand never straying far from her rifle. Back at her cabin, Ruth immediately began preparing for the worst. She moved her most precious possessions, Samuel's cross, his father's compass, and the few photographs she owned, into a canvas bag that she could grab quickly if necessary. She checked her ammunition supply and confirmed that her rifle was clean and ready. Most importantly, she secured extra food and water for Thunder and Shadow, knowing that whatever happened, she would not abandon the creatures who had given her such loyalty. But even as she made these practical preparations, a part of Ruth rebelled against the idea of running. This land held the grave of her husband, buried beneath a simple wooden marker in the clearing behind the cabin. Here were the memories of their brief but happy marriage, the dreams they had shared, the life they had built together with their own hands. To flee would be to abandon not just a place, but a piece of her soul. As afternoon shadows lengthened across the clearing, Ruth made a decision that would change everything. She would ride to Miller's Creek at first light to warn Henrik and see if anyone else had information about the gang's activities. Perhaps there was safety in numbers. Perhaps the scattered residents of these mountains could band together for mutual protection. That evening, as she sat on her porch with Thunder and Shadow pressed against her legs, Ruth tried to convince herself that morning would bring better options. But deep in her heart, she knew that the isolated life she had built was ending. The world had found her sanctuary, and it had come with fire and violence. Thunder suddenly lifted his head, his ears pricked forward. Shadow immediately went rigid, staring into the darkening forest with intense focus. Ruth's hand moved instinctively to her rifle as she strained to hear whatever had alerted her companions. There, the sound of horses moving through underbrush, trying unsuccessfully to move quietly. Multiple horses approaching from the east along the trail that led to Miller's Creek. Ruth's heart hammered against her ribs as she realized that her decision to seek help in them morning might already be too late. She quickly doused the lantern that had been providing light and pulled both dogs inside the cabin. Through a gap in the shutters, she watched shadowy figures emerge from the tree line. 6 men on horseback, their faces hidden in the gathering darkness, but their intent unmistakable. They had found her. The leader raised his hand, and the group halted just outside the clearing. Ruth could hear them talking in low voices, planning their approach. Thunder pressed against her leg, every muscle tensed for action, while Shadow crouched low, ready to spring. These dogs had protected her from mountain lions and bears. They would die trying to protect her from human predators as well. One of the men dismounted and began walking toward the cabin, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol. In the moonlight, Ruth could see his cruel smile as he called out in a mocking voice, "Mrs. Caldwell, we know you're in there. Come out peaceful-like, and maybe we'll make this quick for you." Ruth gripped her rifle tighter, knowing that her life as a free woman was measured now in minutes rather than years. Whatever happened next would determine not only her own fate, but the fate of the 2 loyal creatures who had become her family. The Copper Creek gang had come calling, and there would be no negotiating with men who burned families out of their homes for sport. Through the window, she could see more figures moving through the darkness, surrounding her cabin with practiced efficiency. These weren't random criminals. They were organized, disciplined, and utterly without mercy. Ruth whispered a prayer to Samuel's memory, touched the wooden cross for luck, and prepared to make the fight of her life. But even as she checked her ammunition one final time, Ruth knew that 6 armed men against 1 woman and 2 dogs was not a battle she could win. The best she could hope for was to take some of them with her and ensure that Thunder and Shadow died quickly rather than suffering whatever cruelties these men might devise. The peaceful life she had built in Samuel's memory was about to end in violence and bloodshed. The only question now was whether she would die fighting or allow herself to be taken alive, to face whatever horrors awaited her in the hands of Jackson Briggs and his gang of killers. The cabin door exploded inward with a crash that seemed to shake the entire mountain. Thunder launched himself at the first man through the doorway, his powerful jaws clamping down on the intruder's gun arm with bone-crushing force. The man's scream pierced the night air as his pistol clattered to the floor. Ruth fired her rifle at the second figure silhouetted in the doorway, but in the chaos and darkness, her shot went wide. Shadow darted between the legs of another attacker, sending him sprawling into the overturned table. For a brief, desperate moment, it seemed as though Ruth and her companions might somehow prevail against the odds, but the gang had come prepared for resistance. A heavy rope net dropped over Thunder, tangling his legs and preventing him from reaching the man who was already raising a club toward the dog's head. Ruth swung her rifle like a club, striking one attacker across the shoulders, but two more men grabbed her from behind before she could reload. "Don't kill the dogs yet," commanded a voice from the doorway. The man who stepped into the cabin was clearly the leader. Tall, lean, with cold grey eyes that seemed to evaluate everything with the calculating gaze of a predator. His dark beard was streaked with premature silver, and a jagged scar ran from his left ear to the corner of his mouth. "Jackson Briggs," Ruth whispered, recognizing the description Henrik had given her months ago. "That's right, Mrs. Caldwell, and you're going to be my guest for a while." Briggs gestured to his men, who roughly bound Ruth's hands behind her back with leather cord. "Those dogs of yours are going to serve a purpose too, so we'll keep them alive for now." Thunder continued to struggle against the net, his growls echoing through the small cabin. Shadow had been cornered near the fireplace, where she crouched low, baring her teeth at anyone who came too close. Ruth's heart broke, seeing the terror in their eyes, knowing they didn't understand why the humans they had trusted were now causing them pain and fear. "Why are you doing this?" Ruth demanded as Briggs's men ransacked her home, pocketing anything of value and destroying what they couldn't use. "What do you want from me?" Briggs smiled, but there was no warmth in the expression, only cruel anticipation. "Your husband cost me something precious, Mrs. Caldwell. Now I'm going to cost him something in return." "Samuel's been dead for 3 years," Ruth said, confusion and dread mixing in her voice. "Dead, yes, but not forgotten. Not by me." Briggs picked up the wooden cross from the mantelpiece, turning it over in his hands with mock reverence. "Samuel Caldwell was a territorial marshal before he became your mountain hermit. Did he ever tell you about the day he shot my brother in the back?" Ruth's blood ran cold. Samuel had occasionally mentioned his law enforcement days, but always with reluctance and sadness. He had told her once that violence followed him everywhere until he found peace in the mountains. She had never pressed for details, respecting his obvious pain about that part of his life. "My brother was 17 years old," Briggs continued, his voice growing harder. "Just a kid who made some bad choices. Your husband didn't have to kill him. Could have winged him, taken him alive. But Samuel Caldwell was known for his final justice. 1 shot, 1 kill, no second chances." "You don't know what happened," Ruth said desperately. "Samuel was a good man. Samuel was a killer with a badge," Briggs snapped, hurling the wooden cross into the fireplace where it landed among the glowing coals. "And now his widow is going to pay the price for his righteousness." Ruth watched in horror as the cross Samuel had carved with such love began to blacken and char. The small flame that caught one corner seemed to consume not just the wood, but her last tangible connection to her husband's memory. One of Briggs's men emerged from the bedroom, carrying Ruth's canvas bag, the one containing her most precious possessions. He dumped the contents on the table. A few photographs, some letters from her sister, and Samuel's father's brass compass. Briggs picked up the compass, studying its worn surface with interest. 3 generations of Caldwells carried this, I'd bet, he mused. Always knowing which direction was home, always finding their way back to safety. He slipped the compass into his vest pocket. "Too bad it won't help you now, Mrs. Caldwell." The men finished their destruction of the cabin with systematic thoroughness. They dumped flour and sugar on the floor, broke dishes, and overturned furniture. It was clear that this wasn't just robbery. It was desecration, designed to erase every trace of the life Ruth had built. Thunder had grown quiet in his net, but his amber eyes never left Ruth's face. She could see him trying to understand what was happening, why she wasn't helping him escape. Shadow remained pressed against the fireplace, her intelligent gaze darting between Ruth and the men who surrounded them. "Load them up," Briggs ordered. "We've got a long ride ahead, and I want to be in Copper Creek before noon tomorrow." Ruth found herself hauled outside and thrown onto the back of a horse, her hands still bound behind her. Thunder and Shadow were secured in separate horse-drawn cages that the gang had brought specifically for this purpose. The dogs began whimpering as they were separated, their distress calls echoing across the clearing that had been Ruth's peaceful home. As they rode away from the cabin, Ruth looked back once to see smoke beginning to curl from the windows. Briggs had ordered his men to burn it, just as they had burned the Hendricks homestead. By morning, there would be nothing left but ashes and the memory of a life that had been built on love and destroyed by hatred. The silver wedding ring on Ruth's finger caught the moonlight as the horses climbed higher into the mountains. Samuel had placed it there 7 years ago, promising her a life of peace and happiness far from the violence of his past. Now that past had followed them even here to this remote sanctuary, bringing with it a reckoning that neither of them could have anticipated. Briggs rode alongside Ruth's horse, his presence a constant reminder that her ordeal was just beginning. "Tomorrow, Mrs. Caldwell, you're going to help me put on a show for the good people of Copper Creek. They need to understand what happens to folks who think they can hide from justice. My kind of justice." Ruth said nothing, but her mind was already working. If she was going to save Thunder and Shadow, she needed to understand exactly what Briggs had planned. More importantly, she needed to find some way to turn his obsession with Samuel's memory against him. These men had made one crucial mistake. They had assumed that a woman who lived alone in the mountains, with only dogs for companions, would be weak and helpless. They were about to learn how wrong they were. The town of Copper Creek sprawled along the banks of a muddy stream, its collection of ramshackle buildings and false-fronted stores bearing testament to the hard lives of its residents. Ruth had visited this place only once before, years ago with Samuel, and remembered it as a rough but honest settlement where miners and ranchers came to trade and resupply. Now, as Briggs's gang rode down the main street with their captives, Ruth could see how much the town had changed. Windows were boarded up, businesses stood empty, and the few people visible on the street quickly ducked inside when they spotted the approaching riders. Fear hung over Copper Creek like a shroud, transforming what had once been a vibrant community into a place where hope had been systematically murdered. Thunder and Shadow, still confined in their cages, had grown quiet during the long ride down from the mountains. Ruth could see the exhaustion in their eyes, but also something else, a kind of resigned awareness that their fate was tied inexorably to hers. The leather collars she had hand-stitched for them during countless winter evenings now seemed like symbols of the bond that was about to be tested in the cruelest possible way. Briggs called a halt in front of what had once been the town's courthouse, a 2-story wooden building with a wide front porch that had clearly seen better days. Several of his men were already waiting there, along with what appeared to be most of the town's remaining population. Ruth counted perhaps 40 people, men, women, and children who had been forced to gather for whatever spectacle Briggs had planned. "Bring her down," Briggs commanded, dismounting from his horse with casual confidence. "And get those cages positioned where everyone can see them." Ruth was hauled from her horse and forced to her knees in the dirt of the town square. The chains that now bound her wrists and ankles were far heavier than the leather cords. From the previous night, Briggs was taking no chances on her escaping during his grand performance. Thunder's cage was positioned to her left, Shadow's to her right. Both dogs pressed against the bars closest to Ruth, their eyes fixed on her face with unwavering devotion. She could see that they had been given water, but no food during the journey, another deliberate cruelty designed to increase their distress. An elderly woman in the crowd stepped forward, her face lined with years of hardship, but her eyes still bright with compassion. "What's this poor woman done to deserve such treatment?" she asked, her voice carrying clearly across the square. "Mrs. Patterson," Briggs said with mock politeness, "this is Ruth Caldwell, widow of the famous Marshal Samuel Caldwell. You remember him, don't you? The man who brought such wonderful law and order to our territory." Several people in the crowd nodded reluctantly. Ruth realized that some of these folks had known Samuel during his law enforcement days, had perhaps even been grateful for his protection against the very criminals who now controlled their town. "Samuel Caldwell shot my brother down like a dog," Briggs continued, his voice rising with theatrical anger. "Claimed it was justice, but it was murder, plain and simple. Today, Mrs. Caldwell is going to pay for her husband's crimes." Ruth tried to speak, but one of Briggs's men struck her across the face, splitting her lip and filling her mouth with the copper taste of blood. The crowd stirred uneasily, but no one dared to protest openly. "Here's how it's going to work," Briggs announced, drawing his pistol and checking the cylinder with deliberate showmanship. "Mrs. Caldwell is going to choose which one of her precious dogs dies first. The other one gets to watch, then follows its friend into the next world. After that, well," he smiled coldly, "let's just say that the widow Caldwell won't be mourning her husband much longer." A collective gasp rose from the assembled townspeople. Even in a place that had seen its share of violence, this level of calculated cruelty was shocking. Ruth saw several women cover their mouths in horror, while the men looked away in shame at their inability to intervene. "I won't choose," Ruth said quietly, her voice steady despite the blood trickling from her lip. "Oh, but you will," Briggs replied confidently. "You see, if you don't pick one, I'll just start shooting pieces off both of them until you change your mind. A paw here, an ear there. Dogs can live quite a while missing a few parts." Thunder began growling low in his throat, sensing the malevolent energy directed toward his pack. Shadow pressed herself against the back of her cage, but her intelligent eyes remained fixed on Ruth's face, as if trying to understand what was expected of her. Ruth's mind raced as she assessed her situation. The chains that bound her were heavy, but not impossible to break if she could create enough leverage. The small skinning knife concealed in her boot had somehow escaped. Detection during her capture, perhaps, because Briggs's men had been more focused on the obvious weapons. But even if she could free herself, what then? 6 armed men surrounded her, with more positioned around the square. The townspeople were clearly sympathetic, but too terrified to help. Any rescue attempt would likely result in the immediate execution of Thunder and Shadow, along with innocent bystanders. "You have until I count to 10, Briggs said, raising his pistol toward Thunder's cage. 1, 2, Ruth closed her eyes and tried to think like Samuel would have in this situation. Her husband had been a strategic thinker, always looking for the angle his opponents couldn't see. What would he have noticed that she was missing? 3, 4. The crowd was growing more agitated, with several people whispering urgently among themselves. Ruth realized that Briggs was making a crucial error. He was so focused on his revenge against Samuel that he was losing sight of the bigger picture. By forcing these people to witness such deliberate cruelty, he was creating enemies where he might have maintained fearful compliance. 5, 6. Ruth opened her eyes and looked directly at Briggs. "What makes you think Samuel wouldn't have done the same thing to you that he did to your brother?" Briggs paused his count, clearly not expecting this response. "What's that supposed to mean?" "Your brother wasn't the innocent child you claim he was," Ruth said, her voice growing stronger. "Samuel told me about that day, how your brother had already killed 2 people during that bank robbery, how he was aiming at a little girl when Samuel took the shot. That's a lie." Briggs snarled, but Ruth could see uncertainty flickering in his eyes. "Samuel carried the weight of every life he took," Ruth continued. "He quit being a marshal because he couldn't stand the violence anymore. But he never regretted protecting innocent people from killers, no matter how young those killers might be." The crowd was listening intently now, hanging on every word. Ruth realized she had found her weapon, not the knife in her boot, but the truth about the past that Briggs had spent years distorting to fuel his hatred. 7, 8. Briggs resumed his count, but his voice lacked its earlier confidence. Ruth smiled grimly. She still didn't have a plan for escape, but she had accomplished something almost as important. She had planted seeds of doubt in the minds of everyone watching. And doubt, she remembered Samuel saying, was the enemy of every tyrant who ever lived. 9. Briggs's voice wavered slightly as he completed his count, but his pistol remained trained on Thunder's cage. The massive dog had stopped growling and now sat perfectly still, his amber eyes fixed on Ruth with absolute trust. In that moment, Ruth realized that Thunder was waiting for her command, that even facing death, he would do whatever she asked of him. 10. The word hung in the air like a death sentence. But instead of firing, Briggs lowered his weapon and studied Ruth's face with newfound interest. "You're not what I expected, Mrs. Caldwell. Samuel's little mountain mouse has some fight in her after all. I won't choose between them," Ruth repeated, her voice carrying across the silent square. "If you want to murder innocent creatures to satisfy your twisted need for revenge, you'll have to do it without my participation." Briggs holstered his pistol and walked slowly around Ruth's kneeling form, like a predator circling wounded prey. "You know, killing those dogs quickly would be a mercy, but there are other ways to break a person's spirit." He gestured to two of his men, who immediately began dragging the cages farther apart. Thunder and Shadow both began whimpering as the distance between them increased, their distress calls echoing off the buildings surrounding the square. "Dogs are pack animals," Briggs said conversationally. "Separation from their family causes them terrible anxiety. We could keep them apart for days, weeks even. Feed them just enough to keep them alive, let them watch each other suffer." He paused directly in front of Ruth. "Or you could end their misery right now by making a simple choice." Ruth felt the smooth river, stone in her pocket, the one she had carried for luck since the day she met Samuel. She pressed against it through the fabric, drawing strength from the memory of that first meeting. Samuel had been tracking a group of cattle rustlers through these same mountains when he had stopped at her father's cabin for supplies. She had been barely 20 then, but something in his gentle eyes had told her that this was a man who understood the difference between justice and vengeance. "Samuel wouldn't want me to choose," she said quietly. "He would want me to find another way." "Samuel is dead," Briggs snapped, and his way of thinking died with him. "This is my world now, Mrs. Caldwell, and in my world the strong take what they want from the weak." An elderly man in the crowd stepped forward, his weathered hands trembling but his voice steady. "Jackson Briggs, I knew your brother. Tommy was a good boy once, before he fell in with the wrong crowd. Samuel Caldwell didn't want to shoot him. I was there that day." The square fell silent as all eyes turned to the speaker. Ruth recognized him now. Doc Morrison, the town's physician, who had been practicing medicine in these mountains for over 30 years. His word carried weight with everyone present. "You shut your mouth, old man," Briggs warned. But there was uncertainty in his voice. "Tommy had already killed the bank clerk and a customer," Doc Morrison continued, ignoring the threat. "He was reloading to shoot into a crowd of women and children when Marshal Caldwell took that shot. It was the hardest thing I ever saw a lawman do, but it was the right thing." Briggs's face flushed red with anger. "You're lying." "Tommy wouldn't. I treated the marshal afterward," Doc Morrison said sadly. "He was sick for 3 days, couldn't keep food down. That's not the reaction of a man who enjoyed killing. That's the reaction of someone who did his duty and hated every second of it." Ruth watched as Briggs struggled with this new information. She could see the cracks forming in the foundation of hatred he had built his life upon. But she also knew that men like Briggs were most dangerous when their worldview was challenged. They tended to lash out rather than admit they might be wrong. "Enough." Briggs roared, drawing his pistol again. "I don't care what any of you remember. Samuel Caldwell destroyed my family, and now I'm going to destroy his." But as he raised the weapon toward Thunder's cage, something unexpected happened. Shadow began barking. Not the frightened yelps she had been making, but sharp, purposeful barks in a specific pattern. Ruth's heart leaped as she recognized the sound. It was the herding call Shadow used when the goats had scattered and needed to be brought together. Thunder responded immediately, moving to the front of his cage and adding his deeper voice to the call. The two dogs were communicating across the distance that separated them, maintaining their pack bond despite Briggs's attempts to break it. "Smart dogs," commented one of the townspeople. "They're talking to each other. Animals. Know more about loyalty than some people," added another. Voice from the crowd. Ruth realized that the dog's display of unbreakable devotion was having an effect on the assembled townspeople. She could see it in their faces. Shame at their own helplessness, anger at being forced to witness such cruelty, and a growing determination to somehow intervene. Briggs saw it too. "You people need to understand something," he said, addressing the crowd with cold fury. "This woman's husband thought he was better than the rest of us, thought his badge gave him the right to play God with other people's lives. Well, today we're going to see what his widow is really made of." He reached into his vest and pulled out Samuel's brass compass, holding it up so everyone could see. 3 generations of Caldwells carried this piece of junk, thinking it would always lead them home. But Mrs. Caldwell's home is ashes now, just like her husband's grave will be when I'm done here. The casual mention of desecrating Samuel's grave sent a surge of rage through Ruth that was almost overwhelming. She bit down on her split lip to keep from screaming, tasting blood as she fought to maintain control. Briggs was trying to provoke her into doing something foolish, and she couldn't afford to give him that satisfaction. "You see," Briggs continued, still addressing the crowd while keeping his eyes on Ruth, "the great Marshal Caldwell wasn't so different from the rest of us. He just had better publicity. But when you strip away the badge and the righteous speeches, he was just another killer who happened to be on the winning side. That's not true," Ruth said quietly, but her voice carried clearly across the square. "Samuel believed in something bigger than himself. He believed that good people deserved protection from evil ones. The fact that you can't understand that difference just proves how far you've fallen." Briggs laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "Good and evil? Those are just words, Mrs. Caldwell. The only thing that matters is power. Who has it and who doesn't? Right now, I have all the power, and you have none. Power isn't just about guns and fear," Ruth replied. "Samuel taught me that real power comes from doing what's right, even when it costs you everything." She looked around at the faces in the crowd, seeing her words take effect. These people remembered what their town had been like before Briggs and his gang had terrorized them into submission. They remembered when there had been hope for something better than mere survival. "Your husband's philosophy got him killed," Briggs said with satisfaction. "And it's gonna get you killed too." "Maybe," Ruth acknowledged. "But some things are worth dying for." Thunder and Shadow had stopped their calling and now sat perfectly still in their cages, as if they too understood that a crucial moment was approaching. The hidden knife in Ruth's boot seemed to burn against her ankle, reminding her that she still had one small advantage that Briggs didn't know about. But more importantly, she could see that the crowd was no longer simply a collection of terrified bystanders. Doc Morrison's revelation about the true circumstances of Tommy Briggs's death had planted seeds of doubt, and her own words were watering those seeds with the possibility that resistance might be possible after all. The afternoon sun was beginning to sink toward the western mountains, casting long shadows across the town square. Ruth knew that whatever was going to happen would happen soon. Briggs was too much of a showman to let this drama drag on indefinitely. The question was whether she could find a way to turn his own theatrical instincts against him. As if reading her thoughts, Briggs smiled coldly and reached for his pistol once again. "Enough talking, Mrs. Caldwell. Time to make your choice." The weight of Briggs's revelation settled over Ruth like a shroud. Samuel's past as a territorial marshal wasn't news to her, but she had never fully understood the depth of violence and moral complexity that had driven him to seek refuge in the mountains. Now kneeling in chains with her beloved companions facing execution, she began to grasp the terrible burden her husband had carried. You want to know why I really chose your husband's widow? Briggs asked, circling her again like a vulture. It wasn't just about revenge, though that's certainly part of it. It was about proving that his whole philosophy was meaningless. Samuel Caldwell believed that good people could triumph over evil through righteousness and sacrifice. Today, I'm going to demonstrate exactly how naive that belief really is. Ruth's mind raced as she processed this information. Briggs hadn't captured her simply to cause pain. He was trying to prove a point about the nature of good and evil. That meant her response mattered not just for her own survival, but for the message it would send to everyone watching. Thunder shifted in his cage, and Ruth noticed something she had missed before. The way the big dog was positioned, with his massive frame pressed against the bars, was creating stress on the cage's wooden frame. The structure was solid, but it hadn't been designed to contain a determined animal of Thunder's size and strength. Shadow, meanwhile, had begun a behavior Ruth recognized from their life in the mountains. The border collie was systematically testing every part of her cage, probing for weaknesses with the methodical intelligence that made her such an effective herding dog. Both animals were looking for escape routes, waiting for the right moment to act. "You see those dogs?" Briggs said to the crowd, pointing at the cages. "Perfect examples of misplaced loyalty. They would die for a human who can't even protect herself, let alone them. Just like the fools who used to trust Samuel Caldwell to keep them safe." But Ruth could see that Briggs had misread the situation. The townspeople weren't looking at Thunder and Shadow with pity. They were looking at them with admiration. The dog's unwavering loyalty was reminding these people of something they had forgotten, that some bonds were stronger than fear. Mrs. Patterson, the elderly woman who had spoken up earlier, stepped closer to the front of the crowd. "Those dogs have more honor than you ever will, Jackson Briggs," she said with quiet dignity. "And so does their mistress." "Honor doesn't stop bullets, old woman," Briggs replied, but Ruth noticed that several of his men were looking uncomfortable. They had signed up to rob and terrorize, not to participate in the elaborate psychological torture of a helpless woman and her pets. That gave Ruth an idea, a dangerous one, but perhaps her only chance. If she could turn Briggs's own men against him, she might create enough chaos to give Thunder and Shadow a chance to escape, even if she couldn't save herself. "Tell me something, Briggs," she said loud enough for everyone to hear. "How many of your men know the real story about your brother?" Briggs's face darkened. "What's that supposed to mean?" "I mean, how many of them know that Tommy Briggs robbed that bank because he needed money to pay gambling debts? How many know that he was planning to run off to California and leave his family to face the consequences?" "You don't know what you're talking about," Briggs snarled. But Ruth could see she had hit a nerve. Samuel kept detailed records of his cases. Ruth continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. "I found them after he died. Your brother wasn't some misguided kid who fell in with the wrong crowd. He was a coward and a killer who cared more about saving his own skin than protecting innocent people." One of Briggs's men, a young outlaw with nervous eyes, stepped forward slightly. "Boss, is that true? You told us Tommy was just—" "Shut your mouth, Crenshaw," Briggs snapped. "This woman is lying to save her own neck," but Ruth could see that the seed of doubt had been planted. She pressed her advantage, knowing she might not get another chance. Samuel's records also mentioned the reward money that was never claimed for Tommy's capture. "Seems the bank was offering $500, dead or alive. Tell me, Briggs, what happened to that money?" The young outlaw named Crenshaw looked confused. "What reward money, boss? You never mentioned any." Briggs spun around and backhanded Crenshaw across the face, sending the younger man stumbling backward. "I said, shut up. We're not here to discuss ancient history." But the damage was done. Ruth could see suspicion growing in the eyes of several gang members. Briggs had built his leadership on the foundation of his brother's supposed martyrdom, but that foundation was cracking under the weight of uncomfortable truths. "You want to know what kind of man your leader really is?" Ruth called out to the gang members. "Ask him why he's really here. Ask him why he's so desperate to prove that good people don't exist. It's because he knows that every day he wakes up choosing to be evil, while other people choose to be good, despite the cost. Enough." Briggs roared, pulling his pistol and pointing it directly at Ruth's head. "You want to die like a martyr? Fine, but your precious dogs are going to watch it happen, and then they're going to follow you into the ground." But before he could pull the trigger, Thunder erupted into action. The big dog threw his entire weight against the front of his cage, his powerful muscles straining against the wooden bars. Ruth heard the splintering sound of wood beginning to give way. At the same moment, Shadow found what she had been looking for, a loose board at the back of her cage. With the persistence that had made her such an effective working dog, she began worrying at the gap, widening it with her teeth and claws. The crowd stirred with excitement as they realized the dogs were attempting to escape. Even some of Briggs's men seemed caught up in the drama, unconsciously rooting for the underdogs in this life-and-death struggle. "Stop them!" Briggs shouted to his men, but they hesitated, perhaps unwilling to shoot the dogs while so many townspeople were watching. That hesitation gave Ruth the opening she needed. While everyone's attention was focused on the escaping dogs, she worked her boot against the ground, managing to expose the handle of her hidden knife. It wasn't much, but it was something, a tool that might make the difference between dying helplessly and dying with purpose. Thunder's cage finally gave way with a loud crack, sending splinters of wood flying across the square. The massive dog bounded free, his eyes immediately seeking Ruth, even as Briggs's men scrambled to recapture him. "Now!" Ruth shouted, hoping Thunder would understand. "Protect the pack!" The big dog's response was immediate and devastating. Instead of running toward Ruth, he charged directly at Briggs, his powerful jaws aimed at the gun hand that threatened his mistress. It was the opening Ruth had been waiting for, the moment when courage would face down cruelty in front of witnesses who would remember this day for the rest of their lives. Thunder's charge toward Briggs created the chaos Ruth had been hoping for. But what happened next revealed truths that changed everything she thought she knew about her situation. As the massive dog leaped toward the gang leader, Briggs didn't panic or stumble backward like a man caught off guard. Instead, he sidestepped with the fluid grace of someone who had faced charging animals before, bringing his pistol around in a practiced arc. But instead of firing, Briggs smiled, a cold, knowing expression that chilled Ruth to the bone. "Impressive training, Mrs. Caldwell. Most people don't realize that attack commands need to be precise to be effective." Thunder landed where Briggs had been standing, confusion evident in his amber eyes as he spun to locate his target. The dog's hesitation was momentary, but it was enough to reveal something that made Ruth's blood run cold. "You see," Briggs continued conversationally, as if they were discussing the weather rather than a life-and-death struggle, "I know more about you than you might expect, including the fact that you weren't always just Samuel Caldwell's grieving widow living quietly in the mountains." Ruth's heart hammered against her ribs as she realized what Briggs was implying. Somehow, he had discovered the truth about her past, the truth she had kept hidden even from Samuel during the early years of their marriage. "Before you became the mountain hermit's wife," Briggs said, raising his voice so everyone in the square could hear, "you were Lieutenant Ruth Morrison, attached to the Territorial Army's Reconnaissance Division, specializing in tracking, infiltration, and, most interestingly, the training of military working dogs." The revelation hit the assembled crowd like a physical blow. Even Doc Morrison, whose name Ruth now realized she shared, looked stunned. She had never told anyone in these mountains about her military service, about the skills that had made her one of the Army's most effective scouts. "That's impossible," Mrs. Patterson whispered. "Ruth's just a simple mountain woman." "Nothing simple about her," Briggs replied with evident satisfaction. "Lieutenant Morrison was responsible for disrupting more criminal operations than any other single operative in territorial history. She and her trained animals were a legend among law enforcement and among the criminals who feared them." Thunder had moved to place himself between Ruth and Briggs, but his earlier confidence was gone. Ruth could see that her companion was confused by the changed dynamics, waiting for commands that she couldn't give while chained and surrounded. "Shadow," meanwhile, had succeeded in widening the gap in her cage enough to squeeze through. But instead of running toward Ruth, the border collie began moving in a wide circle around the square, staying close to the buildings and out of sight of most of the gang members. Ruth recognized the behavior. Shadow was flanking, using tactics Ruth had drilled into her during their military service years ago. "You want to know why I really targeted Samuel Caldwell's widow?" Briggs asked, his voice growing louder and more theatrical. "It wasn't just about revenge for my brother's death. It was about capturing the one person who had cost my organization more money and manpower than anyone else in the territory." Ruth's mind raced as she tried to understand how Briggs had learned about her past. She had been careful to bury that identity when she married Samuel, taking his name and adopting the persona of a simple frontier wife. Only a handful of people in the territorial government had known about her covert activities. "The Copper Creek Gang isn't just a collection of random outlaws," Briggs continued, clearly enjoying his moment of revelation. "We're the surviving members of the Meridian Syndicate, the criminal organization that Lieutenant Ruth Morrison spent 3 years systematically destroying." The name hit Ruth like a physical blow. The Meridian Syndicate had been her primary target during her final years of military service, a sophisticated network of criminals who had corrupted officials, terrorized communities, and murdered anyone who opposed them. She had thought they were finished when their leadership was captured or killed during a series of coordinated raids. "You remember Marcus Webb, don't you?" Briggs asked with mock pleasantness. My former business partner? You and your dogs tracked him through the Badlands for 6 weeks before cornering him in that canyon. He told me about those animals of yours, how they could follow a trail that was days old, how they seemed to understand tactical commands like human soldiers. Ruth did remember Webb, a vicious killer who had specialized in murdering entire families to eliminate witnesses. Taking him down had been one of her most satisfying accomplishments. But apparently some of his associates had escaped the army's net. "The beauty of my plan," Briggs continued, "was that it would accomplish 2 goals at once. I'd get my revenge on Samuel Caldwell through his widow, and I'd eliminate the one person who could potentially recognize and expose the surviving members of the syndicate." But as Briggs spoke, Ruth realized he was making a crucial error. In his eagerness to reveal her past, he was also revealing his own, and doing it in front of 40 witnesses who were now learning that their tormentor wasn't just a local gang leader, but part of a much larger criminal conspiracy. More importantly, his revelation was changing how Thunder and Shadow were responding to the situation. Both dogs had been trained for military operations, and while they had lived as simple pets for years, that training was still there, buried beneath the surface. Ruth could see it awakening in their posture, their movements, their renewed focus. "You made one mistake, Briggs," Ruth said quietly, her voice carrying a new authority that made even his men take notice. "You assumed that revealing my past would frighten these people. But what you've actually done is shown them that they have a trained soldier on their side." "A chained soldier," Briggs corrected with a laugh. "Without weapons, without backup, and about to watch her animals die before joining them." "You're right about one thing," Ruth acknowledged. "I am Lieutenant Ruth Morrison, and Lieutenant Morrison never went into the field without a backup plan," as if summoned by her words. A sharp whistle echoed across the town square, not the herding calls that Shadow had been using earlier, but the piercing blast of a military signal whistle. The sound came from the roof of the general store, where a figure in faded army uniform had appeared with a rifle trained on Briggs. "This is Sergeant Major Patterson," the figure called out in a voice that carried absolute authority. "By order of the territorial government, you are all under arrest for crimes against the peace." Ruth's heart soared as she recognized the voice. Tom Patterson, Mrs. Patterson's son and her former partner in dozens of covert operations. He had obviously been tracking the syndicate survivors just as carefully as they had been hunting her. But Briggs recovered quickly from his surprise. "1 man against 6? I like those odds. Who said anything about 1 man?" Patterson replied. Ruth, you might want to give your dogs their operational commands. I think they remember their training better than you expected. Ruth looked at Thunder and Shadow, seeing the alertness in their eyes that she had thought was lost forever. These weren't just loyal pets. They were military working dogs who had been waiting years for their handler to need them again. Thunder, she said clearly, using the command voice that had once coordinated complex operations across hostile territory. Perimeter. Shadow, infiltrate and contain. The response was immediate and devastating. Thunder exploded into motion, using his size and speed to scatter Briggs's men while avoiding their hastily drawn weapons. Shadow emerged from her concealed position like a grey ghost, moving with the silent efficiency that had made her legendary among army scouts. But most importantly, the revelation of Ruth's true identity had transformed the watching townspeople from helpless bystanders into potential allies. They were no longer looking at a helpless woman being tormented by criminals. They were watching a decorated war hero and her trained animals fighting back against the men who had terrorized their community. The battle for Copper Creek had begun, and for the first time since her capture, Ruth believed they might actually win. The transformation of the town square from a scene of helpless terror to active battlefield happened with startling speed. Tom Patterson's rifle cracked from the rooftop, sending one of Briggs's men diving for cover behind a water trough. Thunder moved like a force of nature, his massive frame bowling over another gang member who had been reaching for his pistol. Shadow seemed to materialize from thin air behind a third outlaw, her teeth finding his gun hand before he could draw his weapon. But Ruth remained chained in the center of the chaos, unable to fully coordinate her animal's attacks or defend herself from the bullets that were beginning to fly. The hidden knife in her boot offered hope, but reaching it while bound hand and foot would require precise timing and more than a little luck. Briggs, to his credit, didn't panic at the sudden reversal of fortune. Instead, he grabbed Mrs. Patterson from the crowd, pressing his pistol to her temple as he backed toward his horse. "Call off your dogs, Lieutenant," he shouted over the gunfire, "or this old woman dies right now." The tactic was effective. Ruth immediately whistled the recall command, bringing Thunder and Shadow to defensive positions around her rather than continuing their assault. Patterson's rifle fell silent from the rooftop as the sniper recognized the danger to his mother. "That's better," Briggs said with grim satisfaction. "Now we're going to try this again, but with new rules. Any of you move, any of those animals so much as growl, and I paint the square with this woman's brains." Ruth's military training kicked in, analyzing the tactical situation with cold precision. Briggs had made a strategic error by taking a hostage. It limited his mobility and gave her a specific target to focus on. But he also held the advantage of desperation, and desperate men were capable of anything. "You can't win this, Briggs," she said, her voice steady despite the chaos around them. "Even if you kill all of us, the territorial government knows where you are now. Patterson didn't come alone." "Maybe not," Briggs acknowledged, "but I can still accomplish what I came here to do. I can still prove that good people lose when evil people are willing to do whatever it takes." He gestured with his free hand toward the townspeople, who had scattered for cover when the shooting started, but were now emerging to see what would happen next. "Look at them," he sneered. 40 people watching one old woman die because they're too cowardly to act. Where's their righteousness now? Where's their willingness to sacrifice for what's right?" But Ruth could see something in the crowd that Briggs was missing. These people weren't paralyzed by cowardice. They were waiting for leadership. They had been beaten down by months of terror, but the revelation of her true identity and the sight of organized resistance had awakened something that had been sleeping. Doc Morrison stepped forward, his hands visible and empty. "Let Mrs. Patterson go, Jackson. Your quarrel is with the government, not with innocent civilians." "Innocent?" Briggs laughed harshly. "There's no such thing as innocent, old man. There are just people who haven't been tested yet. Today, you're all being tested." Ruth worked her foot carefully against the ground, feeling the knife handle slide a fraction of an inch closer to where she could reach it. Thunder and Shadow remained motionless in their defensive positions, but she could see the tension in their muscles, ready to explode into action the moment she gave the command. From the rooftop, Tom Patterson called down in a voice that carried absolute conviction. "You're wrong about people, Briggs. I've seen folks do incredible things when they're fighting for something bigger than themselves. The problem is, you've forgotten what that feels like." "Spare me the philosophy lesson," Briggs snarled. "I've seen what people really are when you strip away their pretenses. I've seen them betray their own families to save their skins, sell out their neighbors for a handful of coins, abandon their principles the moment those principles become inconvenient." "Then you've been looking in the wrong places," Ruth said quietly. "Samuel saw something different. I've seen something different. Even in the worst situations, there are always people willing to stand up for what's right." As if to prove her point, young Crenshaw, the gang member who had questioned Briggs earlier, suddenly stepped away from his companions. "I didn't sign up for this," he said, his voice shaking but determined. "Robbing banks is one thing, but terrorizing innocent people, threatening to kill women and dogs, this isn't what you promised when I joined up. Get back in line, Crenshaw." Briggs warned, but his attention was divided now between multiple threats. "No," Crenshaw replied, unbuckling his gun belt and letting it fall to the ground. "I'm done. These people deserve better than what we've been giving them." His defection had an immediate effect on the remaining gang members. Ruth could see doubt in their faces. The same uncertainty she had been trying to cultivate since her capture began. Briggs's leadership was cracking under the pressure of competing loyalties and moral conflicts. But the gang leader still held Mrs. Patterson hostage, and his desperation was making him more dangerous, not less. Ruth knew she needed to act soon, before his deteriorating situation drove him to commit the ultimate atrocity. "You want to know what Samuel would do in this situation?" Ruth asked, continuing to work her foot toward the knife while keeping her voice calm and conversational. "Enlighten me," Briggs replied sarcastically. "He'd trust people to do the right thing, even when it was hard, even when it was dangerous." Ruth looked around at the faces in the crowd, seeing fear and uncertainty, but also growing determination. He'd believe that when good people are given a choice between easy and right, they'll choose right. Mrs. Patterson, despite the gun pressed to her head, managed to speak. "My boy Tom didn't come back here just to save you, dear. He came back because this community raised him to understand that some things are worth fighting for." "Your boy is about to watch his mother die," Briggs snapped. "If that's God's will, then so be it," Mrs. Patterson replied with quiet dignity. "But I won't be the reason these people give up hope for something better." Ruth felt her fingers finally close around the knife handle. The blade was small, designed for skinning game rather than combat, but it was sharp and she knew how to use it. More importantly, it represented hope. The possibility that she could free herself and coordinate a proper defense of the innocent people who were depending on her. Thunder shifted slightly, and Ruth realized that the big dog was positioning himself for a specific type of attack, one they had practiced countless times during their military service. He was preparing to create a distraction that would give her the opening she needed to act. Shadow, meanwhile, had begun the stalking behavior that preceded her most effective maneuvers. The border collie was reading the situation with the tactical intelligence that had made her invaluable during covert operations, waiting for the precise moment when her intervention would have maximum impact. "Last chance, Lieutenant," Briggs said, his voice growing more strained as he realized his control over the situation was slipping. "Call off your backup, surrender your animals, and I might let some of these people live." "No," Ruth replied simply. "I won't do that." "Then you've chosen their deaths over your pride." "I've chosen to trust them," Ruth corrected, "just like Samuel would have done." The knife came free in her hand, its familiar weight reminding her of countless survival situations she had faced during her years of military service. Round the square, she could see people making their own choices. some backing away in fear, others moving closer despite the danger, all of them wrestling with the fundamental question of who they wanted to be in this moment. Briggs's finger tightened on the trigger, and Ruth knew that the time for planning and preparation had ended. Whatever was going to happen would happen in the next few seconds, and the outcome would depend on whether she had correctly judged the character of the people she was fighting to protect. "Thunder," she said quietly, her voice carrying the absolute authority of a military commander. "Execute." The massive dog erupted into motion, not toward Briggs directly, but in a flanking maneuver designed to force the gang leader to choose between maintaining his hold on Mrs. Patterson and defending himself from attack. It was a calculated risk that would succeed or fail based on Briggs's reflexes and Ruth's ability to exploit the opening that Thunder's action would create. The final confrontation for the soul of Copper Creek was about to begin. Thunder's charge forced Briggs into the exact dilemma Ruth had anticipated. The gang leader couldn't maintain his grip on Mrs. Patterson while simultaneously defending against a 100-pound dog, moving with military precision. His instincts as a survivor kicked in, and he shoved the elderly woman away from him just as Thunder's massive frame collided with his gun arm. Ruth's knife sliced through the leather bonds around her ankles in one smooth motion, the blade moving with the practiced efficiency of someone who had escaped from countless restraints during her military service. As her legs came free, she rolled sideways, avoiding a wild shot from one of Briggs's remaining men while simultaneously cutting the ropes that bound her wrists. The town square erupted into chaos as the carefully maintained standoff collapsed into open warfare. Tom Patterson's rifle boomed from the rooftop, covering Ruth's movements, while Thunder and Briggs rolled across the ground in a desperate struggle for control of the gang leader's pistol. Shadow materialized behind the outlaw, who had shot at Ruth, her teeth finding his ankle with surgical precision. The man screamed and went down, his weapon flying across the square to land near Doc Morrison's feet. The elderly physician stared at the gun for a moment, then picked it up with hands that were surprisingly steady. "I took an oath to do no harm," Doc Morrison said to the remaining gang members, "but sometimes preventing harm requires taking action." Ruth came to her feet in a combat crouch, the knife in her hand gleaming in the afternoon sunlight. Years of peaceful mountain living had softened her reflexes slightly, but the muscle memory of her military training was still there, waiting to be called upon. Crenshaw, the young outlaw who had defected from the gang, found himself caught between his former companions and the armed townspeople. One of Briggs's men pointed a pistol at him, clearly intending to execute him as a traitor. But Mrs. Patterson, despite having just been released from captivity, stepped between them. "That boy's under our protection now," she said firmly. "He chose to do right when it mattered." The remaining gang members found themselves outnumbered and outmaneuvered. What had begun as a simple act of revenge had become a pitched battle against an entire community that had rediscovered its courage. But Briggs wasn't finished yet. The gang leader managed to kick Thunder away from him and roll to his feet, his pistol still clutched in his hand. Blood streamed from bite wounds on his arm, and his clothes were torn, but his eyes blazed with the desperate fury of a man who refused to accept defeat. "You think this changes anything?" he roared, swinging his weapon toward Ruth. "You think these sheep have suddenly become wolves? They'll forget all about their courage the moment I'm gone, and then they'll go back to being the helpless victims they've always been." "You're wrong," Ruth replied, moving with the fluid grace of a trained fighter as she closed the distance between them. "They were never helpless. They just needed someone to remind them who they really are." Briggs fired, but Ruth was no longer where he expected her to be. Years of dodging bullets and fighting for her life had taught her to read an opponent's intentions in their body language. And she had seen the shot coming before he pulled the trigger. The knife left her hand in a perfect throwing arc, its point finding the meat of Briggs's gun arm just above the wrist. He cursed and dropped the pistol, clutching his wounded arm as blood seeped between his fingers. But the gang leader's desperation drove him to one final, vicious act. Pulling a second pistol from his belt with his uninjured hand, he aimed not at Ruth, but at Thunder, who was still recovering from their struggle. "If I can't have my revenge on you," Briggs snarled, "I'll take it on what you love most." Time seemed to slow as Ruth realized she was too far away to stop him. Thunder, magnificent and loyal to the end, looked up at his approaching death with the same calm acceptance he had shown throughout their years together. But Shadow had been waiting for exactly this moment. The border collie launched herself from behind a nearby water barrel, her compact frame striking Briggs in the chest just as his finger tightened on the trigger. The shot went wide, splintering wood from the courthouse steps instead of finding its intended target. Briggs went down hard beneath Shadow's assault, the second pistol skittering away across the dusty ground. The border collie's herding instincts had evolved into something far more protective. She had learned to guard her family with the same intensity she had once used to protect livestock. Tom Patterson's rifle spoke once more from the rooftop, but this shot was aimed at the ground near the feet of the last two gang members who were still standing. "Drop your weapons," his voice commanded with absolute authority. "This is over." The men looked around at the scene before them, their leader disarmed and bleeding, their companions either fled or captured, and an entire town that had found its fighting spirit. Slowly, reluctantly, they unbuckled their gun belts and let them fall. Ruth moved quickly to secure Briggs's weapons, while Thunder and Shadow flanked the defeated gang leader. The dog's eyes held no hatred, only the steady watchfulness of predators who would act instantly if their pack was threatened again. "It's not over," Briggs gasped, clutching his wounded arm. "There are others. The syndicate has cells in every territory. They'll come for you." "Let them come," Ruth replied calmly. "We'll be ready." Doc Morrison approached with his medical bag, his oath as a physician, compelling him to treat even the man who had terrorized his community. "This needs cleaning and bandaging," he said professionally, examining Briggs's knife wound. "Don't waste your time, Doc," Briggs said with bitter laughter. "I'm a dead man anyway. You think the syndicate tolerates failure? They'll hunt me down, just like they'll hunt down all of you." But Ruth could see that his words no longer carried the power to terrify. The people of Copper Creek had faced their fears and discovered that courage was contagious. They had learned that evil could be resisted, that good people could triumph when they stood together. Mrs. Patterson helped her son Tom climb down from the rooftop, her eyes bright with pride and relief. "I knew you'd come back when we needed you most," she said, embracing the young soldier who had appeared just in time. "I never really left, Ma," Tom replied. "I've been tracking the syndicate survivors for 2 years, waiting for them to make a move that would let us take them all down at once." Ruth knelt beside Thunder and Shadow, running her hands over their bodies to check for injuries. Both dogs were exhausted but unharmed, their eyes bright with the satisfaction of a job well done. They had protected their pack, just as they had been trained to do years ago in a very different kind of war. "Good dogs," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Very good dogs." The afternoon sun was beginning to sink toward the western mountains, casting long shadows across the town square where the final battle had been fought. But unlike the shadows of fear and oppression that had hung over Copper Creek for months, these shadows brought only the promise of evening peace and the satisfaction of justice served. The capture of Jackson Briggs and his remaining men marked the end of organized resistance, but Ruth knew that the real work was just beginning. The Copper Creek Gang had been more than simple outlaws. They had been the local representatives of a criminal network that stretched across multiple territories, and their defeat would send ripples through that network. Tom Patterson organized the surviving gang members into a makeshift prison using the town's old jail, while Doc Morrison tended to the wounded on both sides of the conflict. The physician's dedication to his oath impressed even the captured outlaws, several of whom had never experienced medical care that wasn't contingent on their ability to pay. "What happens now?" Mrs. Patterson asked as she helped Ruth clean the blood from Thunder's muzzle. The big dog had suffered only minor scratches during his struggle with Briggs, but the evidence of violence needed to be washed away. "Now we send word to the territorial capital," Tom replied, checking the bonds on the prisoners one final time. "The government has been building a case against the Meridian Syndicate for years, but we needed witnesses and evidence. Today gave us both." Ruth retrieved Samuel's compass from Briggs's vest pocket, its brass surface now warm from the afternoon sun. The familiar weight in her palm reminded her of all the times Samuel had consulted it when they were lost in the wilderness, trusting its needle to guide them home. "The syndicate won't just disappear because we captured one cell," she said, voicing the concern that was weighing on everyone's mind. "They'll send someone to investigate what happened here. And when they do, these people will be in danger again." Young Crenshaw, who had been sitting quietly under guard since his defection, spoke up from his position near the courthouse steps. "Maybe not," he said hesitantly. "The syndicate's been having problems for the last year. Territorial disputes, leadership challenges, government pressure. Losing Briggs and this operation might be enough to make them write off this whole region. What do you know about their other operations?" Tom asked, recognizing the value of intelligence from a former insider. "Enough to make trouble for them," Crenshaw replied. "If you can guarantee my safety, I'll tell you everything I know about their supply routes, safe houses, and planned operations." Ruth studied the young man's face, seeing genuine remorse mixed with fear. He couldn't be more than 20 years old, probably drawn into criminal activity by circumstances rather than evil intent. Samuel would have given him a chance to redeem himself. "The territorial government has a program for informants who provide valuable intelligence," Tom said carefully. "New identity, relocation assistance, protection. But you'd have to testify against your former associates." "They were never really my associates," Crenshaw replied bitterly. "I was just another tool they used and planned to discard when I became inconvenient." Shadow padded over to where Crenshaw sat and regarded him with the steady gaze that Ruth had learned to trust implicitly. The border collie's assessment of people was rarely wrong. She could sense character in ways that human judgment sometimes missed. After a long moment, Shadow settled down near Crenshaw's feet, not exactly friendly, but no longer viewing him as a threat. It was as close to an endorsement as the dog was likely to give. "We'll take him into protective custody," Tom decided. "His information could help us dismantle the entire syndicate network." As the sun continued its descent toward the mountains, the townspeople began the process of reclaiming their community. The fear that had paralyzed them for months was giving way to a cautious optimism, but Ruth could see that the scars would take time to heal. Doc Morrison approached her as she sat on the courthouse steps, with Thunder and Shadow flanking her like faithful sentinels. "I suppose you'll be heading back to your cabin now," he said, though his tone suggested he hoped otherwise. "The cabin's gone," Ruth replied simply. "Briggs's men burned it before they brought me here. Then where will you go?" Ruth looked around at the faces of the people who had found their courage when it mattered most. These folks had stood up to evil when they could have simply hidden and hoped it would pass them by. They had chosen to fight for something bigger than their own safety. "I think I'll stay," she said finally. "This community could use someone with my particular set of skills, at least until the syndicate threat is completely eliminated." Mrs. Patterson smiled, the expression transforming her weathered face. "We'd be honored to have you, dear. There's an empty house on Elm Street that's been vacant since the Hendricks family." She trailed off, remembering the tragedy that had started this whole chain of events. "The Hendricks family is alive," Tom said suddenly, producing a telegram from his jacket pocket. "I got word this morning. They were captured during the raid on their homestead, but they escaped 3 days ago and made it to Fort Collins. They're safe." The news brought tears to Ruth's eyes and murmurs of relief from the gathered townspeople. John and Mary Hendricks and their 3 children had survived their ordeal, which meant that Briggs's reign of terror hadn't claimed every innocent life it had touched. Thunder stretched and yawned, finally relaxing as he sensed that the immediate danger had passed. Shadow remained alert, her ears pricked for any sign of approaching trouble, but her tail was wagging slightly, a sign that she, too, understood their situation had improved. As the first stars appeared in the darkening sky above Copper Creek, Ruth realized that Samuel's compass had guided her home after all, not to the isolated cabin where she had hidden from the world, but to a place where she could use her skills and experience to protect people who needed protection. It wasn't the peaceful retirement she had planned, but it was something better, a chance to honor Samuel's memory by continuing the work he had started, surrounded by the kind of community he had always believed was worth fighting for. 3 months later, Ruth stood on the porch of her new home on Elm Street, watching Thunder and Shadow patrol the perimeter of the yard with the same dedication they had once shown to protecting her mountain cabin. The house was smaller than her old place, but it came with something far more valuable: neighbors who looked out for one another, in a community that had learned to stand together against whatever challenges might come. The morning sun painted the streets of Copper Creek in warm golden light, illuminating a town that was slowly healing from months of terror and intimidation. New businesses had opened, families had returned, and the sound of children playing in the streets had replaced the fearful whispers that had once dominated daily life. Tom Patterson had been promoted to territorial marshal, with specific responsibility for dismantling the remaining syndicate operations. His investigation, aided by information provided by Crenshaw and other former gang members, had already resulted in dozens of arrests across 3 territories. The criminal network that had once seemed invincible was crumbling under sustained pressure from law enforcement agencies working in coordination. Ruth had accepted the position of town marshal, a role that seemed tailor-made for someone with her unique combination of military training and law enforcement experience. The badge she wore, Samuel's old badge, discovered among his possessions and formally transferred to her by the territorial government, felt like a bridge between her past and her future. The brass compass sat on her kitchen table beside the morning coffee, its needle still pointing true north despite all the changes in her circumstances. She had thought about burying it with Samuel's wooden cross, which she had carved anew to replace the one Briggs had burned, but decided that Samuel would have wanted her to keep it. After all, it had successfully guided her home, just not to the home she had expected. Thunder padded up the porch steps and settled beside her chair, his massive frame radiating contentment. The big dog had adapted to town life with surprising ease, though he still preferred sleeping under the stars when weather permitted. His presence alone was often enough to deter troublemakers, but his gentle demeanor with children had made him a beloved figure throughout the community. Shadow emerged from beneath the porch, where she had been investigating some minor disturbance that only her keen senses could detect. The border collie had found new purpose in helping to train a group of young men who wanted to serve as auxiliary deputies, teaching them to track and observe with the same skills she had mastered during her military service. "Morning patrol complete," Ruth said to her companions, earning a tail wag from Shadow and a contented rumble from Thunder. The simple ritual reminded her that some things, loyalty, devotion, the importance of protecting what you love, never changed regardless of circumstances. Dr. Morrison approached from across the street, carrying his medical bag and wearing the satisfied expression of a man who had just delivered his 3rd baby in 2 weeks. The return of families to Copper Creek had brought its own challenges, but they were the kind of challenges that spoke to hope rather than fear. "Any word from Tom's latest expedition?" he asked, settling into the chair beside Ruth's. "Telegraph came in yesterday," Ruth replied. "They arrested the syndicate's regional coordinator in Denver, along with most of his operation. Tom thinks they've broken the organization's back, at least in this part of the territory. And young Crenshaw? Living quietly in Oregon under his new identity, married a farmer's daughter, and started a small business making furniture. Seems to be staying out of trouble." Doc Morrison nodded approvingly. Samuel always said that most people weren't truly evil, just lost. Give them a chance to find their way back to the light, and they usually will. Ruth touched the brass compass, remembering her husband's faith in human nature even after years of witnessing its darker aspects. That faith had been tested during his final confrontation with Tommy Briggs, but it had ultimately been vindicated by the young man's brother's decision to choose redemption over revenge. Mrs. Patterson emerged from her house next door, carrying a basket of fresh bread that filled the morning air with its wonderful aroma. The elderly woman had become something of a surrogate mother to Ruth, providing the kind of community connection that her isolated mountain life had lacked. "Any plans for the day, dear?" Mrs. Patterson asked, offering Ruth a still warm roll. "Teaching the Henderson boys how to track," Ruth replied, accepting the bread gratefully. "Their father wants them to learn woodcraft before they take over the family ranch. And this evening, town council meeting, we're discussing the proposal to build a proper school." It was the kind of mundane conversation that would have seemed impossible during the dark months when Briggs and his gang had controlled the community. But that was exactly what made it precious. The return of normal life, normal concerns, normal hopes for the future. As Ruth prepared to begin another day of serving her adopted community, she reflected on the strange path that had brought her to this place. She had thought her story was ending when Samuel died, that her purpose was simply to guard his memory in solitude until her own time came. Instead, she had discovered that her story was really just beginning. The skills and experiences that had once seemed like relics of a violent past had become tools for building a peaceful future. The dogs that had been her only companions in isolation had become partners in protecting an entire community. The new wooden sign at the town limits rid Copper Creek population brave souls, a reminder that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite it. Ruth had learned that lesson in the town square when faced with an impossible choice, and she had taught it to 40 people who now carried that knowledge into their daily lives. Thunder stretched and yawned, ready for whatever challenges the day might bring. Shadow sat alert and watchful, her intelligent eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of trouble. And Ruth rose from her chair with the quiet confidence of someone who had found her true home at last, not in a place, but in a purpose, surrounded by the kind of community that was worth protecting with everything she had to give. The compass needle pointed north, toward the mountains where Samuel rested, but Ruth's heart pointed toward the future that stretched ahead of them all.